Okay. So we'll wait until we are live. The timing, John? Okay, members, can I begin by welcoming you all to the Assembly Executive and Review Committee. We're going to proceed through the agenda. Today's session, we're going to have an oral evidence session with the former First Minister Baroness Foster and former Deputy First Minister Mark Durkan. I'll go to agenda item number 1, which is apologies. I have one from Gary Middleton, and I think apart from that we have pretty much a full house. Next item of business is declarations of interest. Could I remind members that they are obliged to declare any relevant financial or other interest before taking part in the relevant committee proceedings? Is there any member with anything to declare? Matthew?
I should probably declare for the record that one of our witnesses today is a relation of mine. Okay. For full disclosure, it's not Baroness Foster.
Thank you. Next item of business, agenda item number 3, which is draft minutes. Could I refer members to the draft minutes of the meeting held on the 3rd of February 2026, which are at page 6 of the meeting pack. Could I ask members if they're content with the draft minutes? Members content? Okay. Members, next item of business, which is matters arising. Could I advise members that a matter arising in relation to writing to the Assembly Commissioner regarding the budget implications of conducting an engagement exercise will be considered following the oral evidence session. I have no other matters arising. Agenda item number 5, which is review into the Assembly and Executive Reform oral evidence session. I refer members to the following documents from page 14 through to page 55 and page 59. And at this stage, we'll allow our witnesses maybe to take a seat. Okay. Could I begin by welcoming both Baroness Foster of Adramsea and indeed Mark Durkan, respectively former First Minister and former Deputy First Minister. You're both very welcome to today's committee, and we do appreciate you both taking the time to come before the committee to lay out your experiences, both as experienced members of this House formerly in Executive and indeed the wider Assembly. We're going to invite the witnesses to have the opportunity to lay out their case for up to 10 minutes, following which there will be a question session from members. So I'm in your hands. I know, Mark, you formally submitted. Do you want to lead off and then we can come to Arlene for 10 minutes?
Thank you, Chair. Yes, well, my formal submission, if you put it, was just in response to the invitation from a clerk to respond to the questionnaire that had been set out, so it was framed in those terms. Obviously, that questionnaire opened very much with the bald question as to whether you wanted reform or not, and I'm clearly in the camp that advocates reform, and I say that from the perspective of someone who was intimately involved in the negotiation of the agreement, not least in terms of the details of Strand 1. And the fact is that at the time we were negotiating the agreement, I can remember using the phrase that some of the measures that we were talking about would hopefully be biodegradable, that as the environment changed, our reliance on some of those measures or constructs could change and fall away as well. And that wasn't just something that I said inside the negotiations. I also remember using that same term even during the public debates at the time of the referendum in 1998, and got very articulately parodied by Eamon McCann for saying so. But the fact is that some of the features of the agreement were there very much as a response to issues that were emerging in the negotiations at the time. And I know that I can probably safely preempt that words like mandatory coalition may well come up in the course of questions today, certainly in the course of the discussion around the current inquiry of this committee. I can just say that the term mandatory coalition never occurred during the negotiations. We did use terms like elective inclusion, and we used terms like mandate-based inclusion, because the form of coalition that emerged isn't actually mandatory in the sense that nobody's obliged to go into it who doesn't agree to go into it. But the point was the structures that we negotiated in 1998 were such that people weren't supposed to be able to vet or veto anybody else being able to take a position according to their mandate. But particularly courtesy of the St Andrews Agreement, we have ended up with a situation where people have been able to veto everybody else's mandate. So structures that were designed to stop any one party's mandate being discriminated against have ended up in a situation where we have had everybody's mandate actually frustrated and the Assembly itself grounded. One of the other points that I would make about the negotiations in 1998 was that obviously my party, the SDLP, was setting out a model for elective inclusion that involved using either Saint-Lag or the Hunt. And there were serious objections to that idea from some of the other parties. And there was a lot of scepticism, and people were raising concerns about, there will be rogue ministers, there will be solo runs. If ministers have executive authority, there will be no checks and no balances. And that's one of the reasons why devices like petition of concern, that's one of the reasons why details around a programme for government and a budget having to be approved, and therefore setting the overarching parameters in which ministers would work, and the ministerial pledge of office was guaranteeing that ministers would work within the confines and the priorities and purposes of an agreed programme for government, and that agreed programme for government would also dictate the budget, because one of the other things we were at pains to avoid when we were negotiating the agreement in 1998 was creating an executive model whereby the Minister of Finance could essentially dictate to everybody else in terms of proposing the budget or cancelling out proposals or spending plans or whatever. So that's why we ended up with the situation with the pledge of office and the other balances and curtailments on ministerial power. So while executive authority would be vested in ministers as heads of departments, that was in the context whereby they would be accountable to an assembly. They would be bound by the overall programme for government and budget. They would be bound by decisions that were taken by the Assembly and Executive, and that was important as well. So those checks and balances were deliberately built in. We now have a situation where, because of different changes, people are coming up against the limits of some of that, and that may well be an area that the committee wishes to look at. One of the key points, of course, about the negotiation of the agreement was the idea of a joint office of what ended up being framed as First Minister and Deputy First Minister, and essentially that language was there because one of the parties that was central to the negotiation of the agreement would only agree to the idea of the joint office if there was a differential in the titles. But the fact is the office was fully designed to be absolutely consubstantial. Indeed, whenever the legislation, the 98 bill, was being put through Westminster, the shorthand by MPs at the time for all the clauses that referred to the First and Deputy First Minister was the jointlies. That was just the working shorthand tag. So it is meant to be a joint office. In my submission, I'm making it clear that I do think the titles should be equalised. Perhaps more importantly, I would commend the idea of reverting to those offices, that joint office, being subject to election by the Assembly itself. It was very deliberate in the agreement that that joint office was to be subject to open nominations. Any two MLAs could be nominated. The agreement, contrary to what some of the academics and others say, did not specify that it had to be a unionist and a nationalist. It's any two MLAs. Any two could be nominated. Indeed, we subsequently had to look at a situation whereby if there was more than one joint nomination, it would be down to the Speaker to select the order in which those nominations would be voted upon. The point about the joint election by the Assembly was partly to answer a criticism that was being rightly made of the SDLP proposals about maybe a lack of democratic mandate when it came to the key appointments of the executive and the executive business. And so it was made very clear that it would be the Assembly who would appoint the First and Deputy First Minister. And as someone who held that office and was actually jointly elected by the Assembly to that office, I was very clear that I'm accountable to those who appointed me. And I saw a great virtue in me being accountable on a cross-party basis to the Assembly, rather than relying on my position purely because of the nomination by my own party. And I think that's a weakness that was brought in with St Andrews. I also think that having joint election by the Assembly is there not just as a check on those who would occupy the joint office. I think it's there as an added mandate to them and a protection. So in the current instance, if the current First and Deputy First Minister had been actually elected jointly by the Assembly and their position rested on that, it would be a lot easier for the First Minister when she appears in front of a committee to be able to say, you can't question me here on party matters or matters that are to do with my conduct of business as an MLA and my use of allowance. You can question me on those points that are my responsibility as appointed by the executive, as appointed by the Assembly. Similarly, it would also mean that this nonsense that we get sometimes of people upcasting that the Deputy First Minister is supposedly unelected because she was co-opted to this House and then simply nominated by her own party and not by anybody else. The fact is, if the Deputy First Minister was able to say that her position depended on the actual mandate from the Assembly itself, and that's where her mandate derived from, that would mean that she could answer those sort of questions or criticisms as well. So I think there is great strength in moving back to the joint election. And the biggest strength there would be to restore the primacy that was intended for the Assembly. It is forgotten that a key line in the agreement is that the Assembly is the prime source, is meant to be the prime source of authority in relation to devolved responsibilities. And I think that is something that has, that sense of the primacy of the Assembly is something that has decayed over the years. It's not unique to here, it happens in lots of parliamentary systems, and the executive is seen to take primacy and the parliamentary role is seen to be a mere accessory to that. But I do think that it's something where the balance needs to be restored here, and hopefully that's something that could come out of the work of this committee.
Thank you, Mr Durkin. Baroness Foster, I'll leave it over to you.
Thank you very much, Chair, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to contribute to this discussion on the future of the devolved institutions in Northern Ireland. I do so, like Mark, as someone who's had the privilege and at times the burden of being in ministerial office within the Executive and latterly as First Minister. And that experience has convinced me of two things. Firstly, that if we're to make Northern Ireland work and make a tangible difference to everyone everywhere in the country, then effective local decision making is essential. And secondly, that reform, if it is to succeed, must proceed in a way that commands broad consensus amongst unionists and nationalists alike. As a non-aligned now unionist, I believe it's important to say plainly from the outset, Mr Chairman and members, that there is a growing suspicion from grassroots unionism that the language of reform is being deployed not to improve governance, but to tilt the constitutional balance, or indeed to marginalise one tradition following election results. And whether or not that perception is fair, it exists. And in Northern Ireland, as I think we all know around this table, perception has real political consequences. So reform can't be something that's done to one section of the community. It must be something that is agreed in a broad consensus. And I mention that by way of introduction, Chair, because if mechanisms such as cross-community safeguards are only to operate in a way that benefits one community, then we must question the entire basis of people giving their support to the arrangements that have been in place since 1998 and amended by the St Andrews Agreement in 2006. In terms of Strand 1, there's no doubt that trusts can fray when ministers go on solo runs in relation to controversial and cross-cutting decisions, when they don't bring issues to the executive as per their legal duty. And as someone who sat around the executive table for quite a while, I do not conform to the view that requiring consensus on key issues is something that brings stalemate or paralysis. Actually, for the most part, it incentivises parties to work collectively to find agreement. Now, it's not perfect, and it probably takes a lot longer than other administrations, and it's sometimes the pace and scale of progress is slow. However, I believe it is necessary given our unique circumstances. Sometimes I think people forget where we came from and the reason why we have the unique circumstances that we do. Turning to representation, a frequent criticism of the current arrangements is that the arrangements for electing a speaker and appointing FM and DFM unduly favours the unionist and nationalist designations at the expense of those who identify as neither. And it is true that Northern Ireland's population and demographics have changed since 1998. However, it's equally true that 80% of current MLAs still designate as either unionist or nationalist. And it is my understanding that over this past 25 years, the other designation has never been either the largest or indeed the second largest designation in the Assembly, nor has a party from that designation become the largest party overall. So I would in fact argue that if you look at the last 20 years, the other designation has been overrepresented in terms of ministerial office due to the necessary, very necessary arrangements that were put in place around the appointment of the Justice Minister at the time of devolution. So I don't believe it's a serious proposition to suggest that executive power in Northern Ireland could be vested in such a way that either excludes or operates without representative from both nationalism and unionism in terms of their blocks. So removing parallel consent provisions would be, in my opinion, premature at best and reckless at worst. And that's not to say that I don't want to see politics in Northern Ireland normalised. Of course you do. If you look at some of the changes which have taken place, such as the reduction in departments, the number of MLAs, the code of practices that came into place in relation to special advisors, the reduction in special advisors, the review of public administration, there's actually a great deal of evidence that parties locally have at times shown a willingness to make meaningful public sector reform. Changes to the operation of the petition of concern, raising the threshold requiring cross-party support and introducing a cooling-off period were sensible adjustments that were made to the petition of concern process. However, in the main, I believe the goal should not be to abolish minority protections, but to actually cultivate a political culture in which they are rarely needed, and I think that's what the focus should be. Briefly, if I may, Chair, turning to strands 2 and 3, I'm not sure whether that's something that the committee is looking at the moment, but I want to say on the record I would never stand in the way of mutually beneficial cooperation with the Irish Government, where cross-border collaboration on health, infrastructure, trade can tangibly improve the lives of citizens in Northern Ireland and promote greater levels of prosperity. That, of course, should be our goal. However, all that needs to be subject to the guarantee which was secured at St Andrews that there is accountability to the Assembly for such North-South cooperation. And I have been concerned for a long time that the British Irish Council has developed at a slower pace than the North-South Ministerial Council, and if strands 2 and 3 are to work, they need to work in a balanced way. Because I do think that the British Irish Council could drive issues such as energy security, tourism, higher education, infrastructure, and I'm sure this committee is aware that it was the British Irish Council where we picked up the idea during COVID to bring in the shop local card from our colleagues in the Jersey administration, actually. And that we brought that then into Northern Ireland, and it proved to be, I think, very successful at that particular point in time. There are new opportunities east-west now with the UK East-West Council and my own body, which I chair, Intertrade UK, and I hope that we can use those to make progress on some of the strategic areas and the joint challenges and opportunities which we face. So in conclusion, I think the key issue is if reforms are to take place, then they have to be a product of agreement between the parties in this place. I welcome the fact that it is this committee where this discussion is taking place, because I think attempts to solicit unilateral action from the government over the heads of elected representatives would be wrong and I think reckless. And I hope that this committee can focus on the areas where they can find agreement. And if I may, Chair, I would say that I would hope that the funding formula would be one area where the committee might feel that they can find some mechanism where they can agree on the need for reform, because I think we're all agreed that the current Barnett formula and the consequentials that run from it do not provide what is needed for the Northern Ireland economy and the Northern Ireland citizens, and therefore that's something where I think a real pressure for reform could come from this committee. But I'll leave it there, Chair, and happy to take questions.
Okay, thank you both very much for those introductory remarks. I suppose I'll kick off. Quite often I believe whenever many politicians today debate the issue of reform, it's very much through the lens of almost like a chronological snobbery as to what effort it took back in 1998 and indeed in 2007 to re-establish these institutions and try where possible to operate in that broad consensus space that you both outlined. I think first and foremost there will be nobody that operates the political structures that would say that it is not a perfect form of government. But in a sense, it's there because there is a huge difference of opinion, whether that's on constitutional. I mean, we're having a debate even today about communities that don't buy into the PSNI, for example, and how political leaders of today can help encourage that. So there's still huge issues within our communities. I think we would be burying our heads in the sand if we did not recognise that. So looking back, and I'll ask you both this, I'll start off with you, Baroness Foster. Do you think that the cross-community protections and safeguards that were built into not only the Good Friday Agreement but also the St Andrews Agreement remain relevant today, and why?
Well, I think I have indicated in the remarks I've made that I do believe they remain relevant. I know that they slow the decision-making process down. However, I also feel from experience that it can incentivise agreement if there's a willingness to look for agreement and to find a space where consensus can be found. Because I think this place only exists and only runs well when there's a recognition that everybody's not going to get everything that they want to achieve. I mean, if this was a purely DUP administration, it would look very different from a purely Sinn Féin administration. So I absolutely believe that consensus is still needed to build a way forward here in Northern Ireland. That's my view.
Okay, Mark.
Well, let's go back to how we ended up with the emphasis on cross-community consensus in the agreement. It should have been no surprise that we ended up with an agreement that reflected a priority for cross-community consensus, or put a premium value on cross-community consensus in circumstances where that had been integral to the very rules of the negotiations themselves. The paragraphs of the ground rules for the negotiations that actually met consensus in the summer of 97 or of 96, whenever the DUP and the United Kingdom Unionist Party were still in the talks. Sinn Féin hadn't yet joined the talks at that stage, so it was unanimity at that time whenever we renegotiated the ground rules, included the principle of sufficient consensus. And the notion of sufficient consensus was something that parties had come across in terms of our exposure to the South African negotiations and all of the rest of it. So it was felt on a common basis across parties having had experience of the Brooke and Mayhew talks, etc., that there was a value in this notion of sufficient consensus as a way of helping to manage the negotiations, meaning we didn't fall into a rut and stay there. The only difference between a rut and a grave is depth, and that's the problem, is how could you move on? How could you make sure that something didn't become an absolute process breaker as you were negotiating? And so the rule of sufficient consensus now worked differently in South Africa, and we'll not get into all of that here. But the fact is, sufficient consensus as a notion was built into the rules of the talks. Here, it was given the formula of, in our negotiations, if the chair saw that a proposition was supported by parties who overall represented a majority of the electorate, parties who also respectively represented majority unionists and nationalists, then it could be deemed to have sufficient consensus. So when that was a key safeguard in the negotiations, when it was the one part of the rules that the DUP actually supported, and they actually, in a form of enabling opposition, Peter Robinson actually, with agreement with ourselves, went to George Mitchell and said, if you vote those paragraphs first, even though they're much later in the rules, we'll vote for them, and then we can vote against all the other rules after that, using sufficient consensus. So the fact is, when we were negotiating in '98, parties were clear, and particularly I think it was in the minds of the Ulster Unionist Party, that sufficient consensus was one thing that even the DUP had agreed and put a value on. So it shouldn't have been a surprise that we ended up with that in the rules. But we also built in review mechanism into the agreement. SDLP submissions during the talks were actually that the first review should be within 3 years, and other parties kind of said that's too soon, you can't have that. But we said it's maybe good to have it within the first mandate, so that the elections can take place against a backdrop where people are already looking at can we move on sufficiently or whatever. So there is a value in sufficient consensus. The problem is if sufficient consensus is entirely then bound by the clumsiness of designation, and as the person who drafted the designation wording of the agreement, I think that's something that does need to be revised and changed, not necessarily abandoned, but we can put the dimmer switch on it, I would hope, in the sense that, going back to the notion of biodegradable, we shouldn't have to rely on the artificiality of that to the degree in which we do. And I would actually point out to parties that when in the talks rules, sufficient consensus was as per parties. It was that the chair would be able to deem it from parties. When we were negotiating the agreement, we said, well, we're electing an assembly. There could be independents. There could be all sorts of brand new types and classes of parties. Therefore, we don't want sufficient consensus to necessarily be bound on the basis of party labels. We don't want to subject all party politics to be about unionism and nationalism. That was actually the thinking at the time, and that's why we came up with this idea of, to accommodate individuals and independents, that it would be individual designation. When I think about it now, I and others probably had wires crossed there. We thought we were going to be helping the advance and the change in party politics by having the notion of individual designation instead. It has turned out to be a huge difficulty, but I would point out that there has been a move to shift designation to a party basis anyway. The St Andrews Agreement, for the first time, when it says about who can appoint First Minister and who can appoint Deputy First Minister, it's based on parties and designation, which wasn't in the agreement. Parties and designation isn't in the agreement itself. But that has been further compounded with the idea, and it's in legislation, it's currently in the Northern Ireland Act, in section 16, I think it's 16C or whatever, that actually says, regardless of individual designation, a party will be deemed to be unionist or nationalist if a majority of the MLAs are individually designated as unionist or nationalist. So it has taken on kind of a card vote basis. And so maybe that's a direction to go. Relax the concentration on individual designation and leave it a bit like happened at the Business Committee and all the rest of it, that it's a bit more of a card vote, that it's the call of a party whip or party leader, whether it relies on that, and therefore that MLAs, in taking their seat, don't have to go through the, what is awkward for some, this idea that the first thing they do with their mandate is reduce it to whether or not they're unionist, nationalist or other.
So would you accept that, those cross-community protections and the need for broad consensus, which you admit were at the heart of the 1998 agreement, would you not accept that equally they are as important today to ensure stability? I often hear that they are a barrier to stability in this place, but one could put the argument that they're essential to stability, particularly when we look at recent examples when we look at the changing of voting mechanisms for the 300 areas of EU law that went across with the disablement of that cross-community voting. That has had a huge impact on the unionist community's particular viewpoint of what reform would look like, whether or not we've moved now towards a majority rule when it suits. Do you have any comments on that and how important it is today?
Well, first of all, some of the particular issue that you're raising goes back to the question of who made those rules, and that was that obviously derived from Brexit, and the legislation for Brexit ended up resting on the notion of the sovereignty of the UK Parliament, and the fact is, all parties, some parties liked how the UK Parliament made the post-Brexit choices, or liked some of the choices and not others, and different parties had different attitudes to different post-Brexit choices that were made in the name of the sovereignty of the Parliament, which overrode the positions of parties here.
What I'm trying to get at is not that we could debate all day about the process in terms of how we got to a decision. What I'm trying to understand is that need for cross-community consensus.
Yeah.
Do you recognise that it is equally valid to argue that those are essential for stability today?
Well, and I think there is a huge value in cross-community consensus. I mean, how often do parties find themselves making the point when talking to British government or others that all parties have agreed something? I mean, when we think about the Legacy Act of the last government, parties were all happy to make the point that all the parties have opposed this or whatever, and so there can be value in being able to advertise that sort of cross-community consensus. Going back to the agreement, part of the point of cross-community consensus when it came to things like the programme for government and budget was about setting a framework, and a clear framework, declaring, right, these are already the agreed priorities and purposes, and these are what people have to deliver on. So the idea of consensus as giving an enhanced mandate, so of laminated decision making, that this thing is valid because it has the support on a cross-community basis, and in many ways it should be a case of using cross-community consensus to say there's an added value, there's an enhanced mandate to something. And interestingly, there's an example of that in the very arrangements that you're talking about, in that the review mechanism around the application of certain sections of the protocol or stroke Windsor framework works on the basis that if it's passed by a majority, it stands for 4 years. If it's passed by cross-community majority, it stands for 8 years. So that idea of giving an enhanced status to cross-community support, I think, is good and is useful. It was the logic, as I say, around the idea of programme for government and budget, etc., all having to be done first. It's the logic of saying that ministers are bound by decisions that are taken by the Assembly and the Executive rather than free to act on their own. So there is a value in cross-community consensus. The problem is where that principle of cross-community consensus is turned into not just treated just as a veto, but where it's turned into a predictive veto, where even the civil service decide we're not surfacing that issue or even going to frame ideas on that issue because we think somebody or other is going to veto it, therefore there's no point in even discussing the issue. That's why we've got into the dysfunctionalism that we have got into.
Ernest Foster, I've talked earlier that in my comments to Mr. Durkin that there is a considerable number of people in society today that look that the removal of cross-community protections is indeed a return to majority rule. You talked in your opening presentation that there is a fear among many unionists that this could lead to deeper instability. In fact, in some ways, domination of a particular designate within the Assembly. Do you want to elaborate on that feeling that you're picking up within the community?
Yeah, I just feel, Chair, members, that sometimes when there's a blockage and there's a difficulty and the problem arises between the parties, the first course of action is to call for reform. And that shouldn't be the first course of action. The first course of action should be, of course, to try and find a way around the problem. My former boss, your former boss, Peter Robinson, used to always say, the way to deal with this is to make a problem bigger. I think you'll probably remember that comment too, Mark. So to try and find a way to deal with an issue rather than to say, oh, this isn't working, we need reform. Because I think if you do that all of the time, then the people you're representing are sort of wondering what is going on up there if we're spending more time talking about reform instead of effective governance and looking to their needs and what they need to have delivered. And picking up on Mark's point about the programme for government, I do think that there is a need, and we didn't achieve it in my time, before somebody says it to me, to have a budget line associated with the programme for government would be a very welcome move forward. And again, that goes back to our funding formula and the need to have a needs-based funding formula from the Westminster Government. This is something that I hear my Welsh colleagues raise a lot as well in the House of Lords. So it's something that I think you could find consensus across the UK for the need. I mean, let's not forget the Barnett formula was a temporary formula in 1978. Which is when it came in. So I think it's about time that there was more of a sustainable formula for funding across the UK and in particular for Northern Ireland.
Okay. Going on to your time, both of you serving in the executive, obviously we've talked about the requirements for broad consensus. So could I ask, in your experiences in your respective ministries and indeed leading the devolved government, do you feel that broad consensus acted as an incentive or a deterrent for good government?
Both. I think at times there was a realisation that in order to get the other side, so-called, to agree to a way forward, then there had to be negotiations. In the early part of my time in the executive, there used to be a lot of conversations which took place before the executive to try and move things on before the agenda actually came to the executive for agreement. In the New Decade, New Approach agreement, you'll recall also that the Party Leaders Forum was set up to be an early warning system to deal with issues that were going to cause difficulties for parties around the executive table. I'm not sure whether the Party Leaders Forum is still working. I hope it is, because I did think that that was a way to try and deal with some of those issues. So it can become a blockage if there's not a willingness to look for solutions, but I think it can also incentivise solutions as well.
Well, similarly, I mean, in the early days of the operation of the institutions here, there was value in not just seeking, cross-community consensus where you could manifest it, but also trying to make sure there was as much cross-government understanding and buy-in as well. And so, we had what was called the Ministerial Representatives Committee that would meet in advance of the executive, and that meant there was one civil servant and a special advisor from each of the departments together, just looking at the business and ironing out any possible apprehensions, misunderstandings, surfacing any particular policy interests or whatever that departments might have in relation to some proposals that maybe another department hadn't fully thought about. So there was some pre-washing through before the executive, and that certainly helped. And in particular, that was helpful in circumstances where not all parties had their ministers coming in to this room. This was the room in which the executive met in those days. So when everybody was not there, it actually was useful in that sense. As the finance minister in that first executive, I found myself in the position of obviously meeting and dealing with ministers who weren't attending the executive, and then making recommendations to the executive that reflected their interests and perspectives. not as DUP ministers, and I used to hear from colleagues who were in around here, why are you giving this money to DUP departments and Sinn Féin departments, and what about us? To which I had to say, well, you should have picked different departments. But it's trying to make sure you do things on a basis that is party blind in that sense. That's hugely important for the civil service as well. And remember, the idea of getting added consensus and enhanced consensus and understanding, and it was meant to be within the context of agreed programmes for government, which wouldn't be just agreed in this room, but agreed in the Assembly, that they would directly inform the budget, and that was directly written into the agreement, that the budget had to reflect programme for government, etc., as agreed. And that would be partly to make sure that there was more prospect of long-termism, that there would be follow-through on decisions. And the civil service would know that, well, decisions that are now taken will broadly hold, even if the party that holds a given ministry changes. So even if there's a change in the personality or the party of a minister, it's not a case of everything then changes according to the policy brief of that department just because there's a different party or a different minister. So, and I do think, there are questions about, reform of civil service as well that need to be looked at. I know that may well go beyond the purview of this committee's inquiry. Similarly, I recognise that some of the questions around budgetary issues that Arlene has touched on may go beyond your view as well. But again, going back to my observations in that first mandate of the Assembly Executive, I surfaced at that time, along with the civil service, that the Barnett formula was going to give us serious difficulties and serious strains. And we tried to get a united position to say we needed to seek a needs-based funding formula. But that was opposed at the time. And it was opposed supposedly by unionist politicians. The DUP specifically opposed raising the Barnett formula or having any challenge to the Barnett formula on the basis that they said that was one of the crown jewels of the union, as it was that Northern Ireland was given this advantaged position out of the Barnett formula. And we tried pointing out that over time things were going to change, the funding line was going to taper, and that was going to put a serious strain on our budget. Now I'm glad there is a wider realisation of that. It may well go beyond the purview of this committee, but we also need to recognise that when you're looking at funding formula, then you are into the broader question of what is the broad devolved remit. And again, you're back to what's the residual powers at Westminster. And so when it comes to budget and revenue raising, there are powers that lie in Westminster under the surface that could still be activated against the shared democratic interest that all the parties in here and in the chamber more broadly represent.
Yeah. I think, and I'll finish on this to allow members to come in, I believe there's probably unanimous support in these institutions for a fundamental look into the reform of public services, and you both outlined some very interesting examples, particularly budgetary examples and others. But when it comes to reform of the structural institutions and how they format, there is a wide variance of views on that and what impact that potentially would have. And I think that's important that we take that on board. I think it was mentioned earlier, particularly the viewpoint around designations, with 80% of the Assembly still operating under that model in terms of designating unionist or nationalist. I wanted your viewpoint on this, that how destabilising and in fact probably dangerous to the survival of these institutions would it be for reform to be enacted on some of these key provisions, particularly cross-community protections, above the head of a broad consensus and buy-in from the political parties here who democratically stand for election, secure a mandate and put forward the views of their community. What is your view on how that, because there has been calls from for the British government to intervene, for the Irish government to intervene. How important is it that there is consensus on the democratically elected parties that take their place in the Assembly?
Well, I go back to the point I made. Where we can achieve consensus, there's an added value in that. I don't think everything should depend on absolute consensus. I mean, going back to the agreement, we recognised that there were some things that were directly put in the purview of the Assembly and the Executive. We also recognised that there was other things that weren't, because they were going to be less amenable to consensus. So, for instance, the whole question of the Platform for Rights, the Bill of Rights, it wasn't actually to be left subject to agreement in the Assembly or the Executive or among parties. Now, it was left that there would be recommendations or advice from the Human Rights Commission, but the legislation for that would be with Westminster, because it was recognised that the idea of achieving consensus on those things was going to be futile. Unfortunately, subsequent British governments then used consensus as the yardstick for whether or not anything could happen around a Bill of Rights. So I think there is a danger in putting on the false precondition of consensus, particularly if it locks us into serial dysfunctionalism. At some point, something has to happen that cuts through that cycle of dysfunctionalism. But it shouldn't jeopardise the inherent underlying foundational safeguard around putting a value on cross-community consensus. And so if I take, the danger is we have exaggerated cross-community consensus, and almost we've made it, you have to throw a six to start. There has to be cross-community consensus before an issue can be even tabled or an idea can be tabled, and that's wrong. Remember, the idea of a petition of concern was there as a trigger. And if you look in the agreement, the petition of concern was simply to be a trigger for a special proofing procedure around equality or rights. It wasn't a petition of veto, it wasn't a petition of objection even, but in practice, because the legislation translated wrongly and then standing orders didn't do things right, we've got into a situation where the petition of concern became a bit of a dead-end veto, and it was able to be played like a joker. So cross-community consensus being used as a negative, as an impediment to debate and discussion is wrong. Cross-community consensus as a way of adding value and, as I say, laminating the mandate around things is a positive, and it is something that should be maintained, but it should be maintained in a proportionate and proper manner.
Oh, I don't want to delay because I know members will want to ask questions, but I will say this. I don't accept that cross-community consensus is a condition precedent for discussion. In many ways, I think people will have different mandates. They will set out their positions and manifestos. They will then bring their positions to the table and try to persuade colleagues from different parties to move forward and to find a consensus. So I don't accept it's a condition precedent. I do think that it's necessary for this place to work, that you have cross-community consensus, because no matter what mechanisms people bring in to stop people walking out of this place, anybody can walk out at any time. We've seen that over the years. You don't need a mechanism to stop people from walking out. People can leave the Executive and Assembly if they don't believe it's working for their community. So that's not something we should shy away from. The reality is we need cross-community consensus to make this place work. I think people bring their ideas and then you use the art of persuasion to try and get people onto your plate.
Okay, thank you both. Members, we have a list of questions here, so we'll try to get through them. So firstly, Pat.
Thanks, Chair, and thanks, Arlene and Mark, both for coming in today. I suppose we're discussing this issue of reform because of the sort of groundswell of opinion out there that the Assembly and Executive isn't working in a way it was supposed to. And I suppose the media have probably helped that view out there insofar as they tend to focus on the negative rather than some of the positive stuff. I mean, I remember when I was on this committee some years ago, there was this perception that the Assembly didn't produce as much legislation as other legislatures in these islands. And when the IRC committee actually commissioned research, it showed that the Assembly was well up there in terms of the legislation output. So, but be that as it may, we're in this situation, in this discussion about reform. And I know, Arlene, you've mentioned the issue of the funding formula. I don't think anyone disagrees with that. And we certainly saw consensus in terms of approaching the Treasury about the fiscal floor and all of that. But outside of that, in terms of the institutions and in terms of reforms of the institutions, Are there any reforms that you can think of or you'd like to highlight that you think might make the institutions more sustainable?
Thanks, Pat. In terms of, and I agree with your perception point, because I think we do have a negative story that tends to come from this place rather than some of the positive things that are actually happening. And, good news doesn't sell newspapers, unfortunately, as we used to say. And it is important that the Assembly gets out the positive stories. And I mean, just in that regard, I want to congratulate the Executive in bringing forward the recognition of those who suffered as a result of abuse in institutions. I was really pleased to see that happening last week, because it's something I was involved with in the Executive for quite a while, so really pleased to see that actually coming to fruition. But in terms of reforms, I think when we think of reform, we think of the institutions principally, but there are other practical reforms that I think we need to look at as well, including, I have to say, civil service reform. We need to look at our civil service to see if they are fit for purpose. And dare I mention it, when we had the RHI issue and we looked at the expertise of our civil service, there was a need to look at that again, and I think that has gone by the wayside, and I think there should be more interaction between what's called the Home Civil Service and our own civil service to try and build up the expertise of our civil service, because ministers rely very heavily, I have to say, on their civil service to give them expert opinions, and if we're not getting that to support us in the work that we do, then there's an issue there. So civil service reform is certainly something I think that this committee should be looking at as well.
Okay, and thanks for that. And given that you mentioned the whole issue of institutional abuse and so on,
yeah,
and I was on the TEO committee when you were in the First Minister's role, and I want to commend you for your role in that as well. That shouldn't be bypassed. And I know you're not here representing the DUP, but you were previously, obviously, a member of the DUP. Is it not fair to say that one of the problems with the blockages in the institutions here is that the DUP have never really bought into the Good Friday Agreement?
No, I don't think that's right at all, Pat, particularly after the 2006 St Andrews Agreement. I think that the DUP absolutely did buy into the process then, and we actually had a period of time between 2007 and 2015, I want to say, of really stable, devolved government at that time, and then we all know the reasons why it didn't happen for a while after that. But I hope that the Assembly and Executive can get back to a position where there is stable, devolved administration again. I just think that if every time there's a problem, everybody throws their hands up and says we need reform of the institutions, surely the focus should be on building resilience and building stability. And I do have some sympathy for the position that you can only really have reform when you have a period of stability in the institutions, so that you can look at them in that way.
You see, I ask you that question because there's a perception in the nationalist Republican community that unionism in general, and it's not just the DUP, remain hostile and antagonistic to aspects of the Good Friday Agreement, particularly around equality and parity of esteem, and the hostility towards the Irish language and so on. Gordon Lyons has joined the case against bilingual signage going up in Central Station, and we had your own crocodile moment, which I think you probably regret, and I think you've expressed regret because it gave a boost to the Sinn Féin campaign.
It did give a boost.
Rather than any other reason. But how do you as a unionist face up to or deal with that perception in the nationalist community that there remains that hostility and that obdurance when it comes to equality and parity of esteem? Well,
I don't accept that, Pat, as you would expect me not to, because I think actually for a lot of unionists, they see parity of esteem being used against them, and they want parity of esteem. If they could only get parity of esteem, I think they would be quite happy. And I didn't mention the solo run of your minister on the Irish language signage, but really that should have went to the executive, and now we have the position where ministers are taking other ministers to court, which doesn't bode very well for the optics of how this place is working. It has happened in the past as well, as you know, when the Agriculture Minister took a decision that should have come to the executive, and it ended up in the courts as well. So the idea of solo runs just eats at the trust issue, and I think there's an issue there that really ministers need to reflect upon as well.
Do you really think, Arlene, in this day and age, in 2026, that the erection of bilingual signage in a public building is controversial?
Well, I do, because of the history and because of the way in which, unfortunately, the Irish language has been used as a weapon against unionist areas, and it almost becomes a demarcation in the way that marking of curbs happened in the past. I regret that. But unfortunately, that is very strongly the perception that is out there in the unionist community. So therefore, it was a controversial issue, in my opinion, that needed to come to the executive for discussion and for agreement, and have an incentive to find agreement around those areas. Because I do think we have landed in a position where we have a minister for the Irish, or a commissioner for the Irish language, we have a commissioner for Ulster Scots language and Ulster British Commission, and we have a director for identity, and those people could have helped with that situation.
Okay, thanks for that. Mark, I'll ask you the same question in a different way, because you know the perception out there that the DUP in particular didn't buy into the Good Friday Agreement, hasn't accepted the principles in the Good Friday Agreement, certainly hasn't accepted the spirit of the Good Friday Agreement. In that context, irrespective of what reforms are brought into the institutions, are the institutions going to be sustainable?
Well, we have the institutions. They're there as mandated, going back to the agreement on the referendum for the agreement. So I think it's incumbent on all of us to make the most of those institutions that are meant to manage so much of our public affairs and public estate and public services. So we need to optimise those as far as possible. That's without prejudice to the very legitimate case that there is for pursuing a change in the constitutional status of Northern Ireland, and therefore changing the context within which a lot of these questions are framed. I think you can believe and do two things. You can pursue the two legitimate and commendable agendas at the same time. I don't think one has to be at the expense of the other at all. So if we keep coming up against any question of reform that a key party isn't impressed with that case for reform and has a reason to be suspicious against it, and therefore that negates, that stops the reform debate, then yeah, we stay in a rut here as far as institutions are concerned. And as I said earlier, the only difference between a rut and a grave is depth. So the longer we stay in these ruts, I think the worse it is for everybody. But people will draw conclusions about a level of futility around pursuing improvement and enhancement in the democratic performance of these arrangements. It should be said, this very committee was set up as part of the St Andrews Agreement, as part of, the DUP's narrative at that stage of saying, we're agreeing to this, but we're not actually accepting the Belfast Good Friday Agreement, and we have created this committee as a permanent feature because we are going to be permanently and continuously trying to change the Belfast Agreement and the Good Friday Agreement, and that when it's come to it, most of the issues that have come in front of this committee have ended up meeting a lot of resistance from the DUP for reasons that we understand and have heard, because people are worried about what's the direction of travel. Is it trying to erode certain precepts while pushing others. So that's one of the reasons why we need to discuss these things a lot more. So just as people were apprehensive and had misgivings about the idea that we should be building a case to challenge and change the Barnett formula, and that met resistance because people felt that somehow it was going to be offensive to unionism to pursue that agenda, we just have to continue to work on things and to try to reassure that things that are being put forward for democratic improvement aren't with some ulterior agenda about trying to undermine unionism per se, or any identity or legitimate interests per se. I mean, I go back to the point again, it's not just that we should do things on a cross-community basis, but also on a cross-party basis. Arlene has mentioned, in terms of what has happened, in terms of the progress that was made in relation to the question of institutional abuse. I seconded the motion. That was the paving motion, Carmel Hanna's motion. And I can remember pleading that day to Michelle to withdraw the DUP amendment that was trying to preclude any idea of a public inquiry. Now, that motion didn't say there had to be a public inquiry because it was about a paving motion, it was about scoping the question, but there was this amendment that was saying it had to rule out any idea of a public inquiry, and as to why that was there or whatever, but on the day, there would have been a huge virtue in having consensus, having unanimity in the Assembly, particularly as victims' representatives were gathered there, and that's what had happened in the Dáil on the back of the Ryan report, etc., and that was denied. So I use that again to point to the value of cross-community and cross-party consensus where it can be achieved. There is an added value to that. Going back to some of the questions that were raised earlier about so-called solo runs and all of the rest of it, again, that was part of what was the original intention around a petition of concern, was this idea. In particular, people raised questions that, ministers will take all sorts of decisions during recesses. And what's going to happen? And the petition of concern was there partly as a recall mechanism and partly just to say, no, if there is concern that something that's been done is raising sensitivities around equality or human rights, there is a device essentially to call that in and look at it. But there was a dedicated procedure to be looked at to see, is there a case to answer here, or is there a way of modifying or improving things? That's what the petition of concern was meant to be for. And so it's the kind of thing that should have been used when it came to the controversy around the decision about the LIFA grant, for instance. That's exactly the sort of thing it was intended to be used for, but that's not the position that we fell into. And if I can, Chair, just touch on one other aspect that was raised that I think is relevant to Pat's question and the question of perceptions about attitudes around communities. If parties are going to say, for instance, in relation to, and it's already been mentioned, and you mentioned it yourself, Chair, about the question of policing and police recruitment, if parties are going to say that it's up to other parties to do more about improving levels of applications from one section of the community to policing or another, those same parties need to think how far they can sustain this idea that there can't be a nationalist who is a Minister for Justice. Because once you send out that signal that there is something about justice, and in fairness to Ministers of Justice, they haven't had played any direct hand in policing or policing decisions, consistent with Patton, etc. And the one time that there was a danger around that, around the NCA arrangements, there was a pullback and there was a change there. But the fact is that sends a signal. And when a signal is sent that serious leadership in this community is saying that nobody of a particular political stripe can serve as an accountable Minister of Justice in here, that sends out a signal in the community that certain people can be trusted with certain things, that certain interests will prevail, that certain suspicions prevail. That sends out a fundamentally dangerous and difficult signal, and that's something that needs to be addressed.
Thank you, Chair.
I'll not labour on that point in particular, but we often have it reminded to us in the Assembly that it's an operational matter from the Justice Minister when it comes to policing, of which every party, party that are represented on this committee have been a member of the policing board, so they have had involvement in policing for a long number of years.
Yes, but it still sends a signal.
I would categorically disagree with your
it sends a signal.
Members, we will keep moving. So, John.
Thank you, Chair, and Baroness Foster, Mr. Durgan. Thank you so much for coming along today. I think it's been a really useful evidence session so far. Just from the Ulster Union's point of view, we fully support institutional reform, but it needs to be on the basis of protecting the delicate balance of cross-community consent that was achieved in 1998. You'll not need to tell yourself, Mark, the amount of effort that went into that, but even the architects of the Good Friday Agreement accepted that 25, 26, up to 30 years on, that the institutions would evolve and would reform, but that wouldn't be just reform for the sake of it. It would need to also protect the delicate balance that was achieved. We've heard from some members and from some evidence givers about the values potentially of a citizens' assembly in achieving these potential reforms. I have my own personal views that I think the citizens' assembly sits right here, and that this committee is the institutions to look at the reforms to get that achievement in balance and in cross-community consent on it. I'm just interested to hear your thoughts on the potential benefits or pitfalls of a citizens' assembly and what that might achieve, given what we've discussed already.
I don't favour citizens' assembly. I don't think that'll come as a huge shock to you. I think people are elected into this place to do a job, and this is the place, the ARC committee is the place to discuss reform and to look for solutions, and to then persuade other members of those solutions. I mean, Mark's talked about various things that have happened in the past, and there has been a change in the future. Surely that's a good indication of the art of persuasion and the need to move politics on, and actually for people to have discussions and then to find consensus. And that to me is what this place is all about. I mean, there has been reform already. I mentioned the petition of concern and the changes that were made to that. So there has been incremental reform, not enough for some people, I accept that. However, to suggest there has been no reform at all since 1998 or 2006 is just not correct. So I do believe that this is the place where the discussion needs to take place.
And yourself, Mark?
Yeah. Well, remember the original agreement provided for a civic forum in the north. It also provided for a north-south consultative forum as well, and the two ideas were kind of locked together in some of our heads. I think the Civic Forum did a very good job, and I say that as someone who engaged with them both as Minister of Finance and also then as a joint First Minister. I thought they played a positive role, and the Civic Forum could have continued to play, I think, a very significant role in terms of being able to be a bit of an outrider in terms of some serious policy issues. I think around the whole question of academic selection, I think we may have ended up at a more productive place than we have arrived at, had a body like the Civic Forum been able to frame a lot of the issues and take forward a lot of the proposals that had emerged from the review that had been appointed by Martin McGuinness, a review that was appointed under the Programme for Government. I would hasten to add, which Martin was at pains to say at the time as well. So I think in terms of taking forward some of those ideas and discussions, I take fully what you've said, John, about the primacy of the Assembly, and I go back to the point to make. The agreement says the Assembly should be the prime source of authority and devolved responsibilities, but it is not the only source of wisdom. And I think citizens' assemblies have proved a value in terms of being able to ventilate ideas and amplify issues in ways that sometimes the machinery of government isn't able to do, and even the operation of politics in a chamber like the Assembly isn't always able to do. So I think there are additional sidelights that can be provided that are then helpful to parties. So I don't think it usurps the role of a legislature like the Assembly at all, to have citizens' assemblies looking at issues and options and ideas, and being able to screen out some ideas that might at first sight seem great and wonderful, but being able to point out that there's all sorts of problems with those or whatever. So I think there is value in that. So I wouldn't rule out citizens' assemblies or anything else. But I do think that, it's incumbent on the political institutions to show a capacity for reform themselves, and to fully take your point that we need to make sure that in terms of reform, we don't throw the baby out with the bathwater as far as anybody's concerned. And I think, we do need to differentiate between supporting walls and stud walls when it comes to reform. So there's certain things can be knocked through and changed, and it's comfortable. There's other things that go more fundamentally to the architecture of the agreement itself. And so there needs to be discernment when it comes to reform. But the need for discernment shouldn't mean we abandon looking at the case for reform and moving meaningfully on it.
Thank you. Moving on, we've talked about the perception among the public, and it's probably, sadly, at an all-time low, despite the fact there being some good work done from this place. But the reality is that people still don't accept that, and what they do see, sadly, is regular collapse of the institutions, which invariably then lead to a hiatus that leads to a backlog in outputs, poor functionality of the civil service. I know you talked about that, Baroness Foster. So, two aspects, if I may. What do you think we could do to protect the institutions from collapse going forward, potentially? And secondly, how can we better reform how departments work internally and cooperating on cross-cutting issues? Because we hear that there is work going on between departments, but invariably when we have big cross-cutting issues, we end up in a silo mentality, and that doesn't lead to good government, in my opinion, and doesn't lead to output. So maybe in your experiences as ministers as well as in the executive office, your thoughts on that?
Well, no, it doesn't lead to good government when you have siloed mentalities, and we had an example of that when we had the Climate Change Act having that really detrimental impact on the A5 going ahead, which was catastrophic, because we've spent over £155 million on a road that hasn't even started yet, and which is so needed. In fact, today there's another really serious accident on the A5. So, there has to be more and better. And I mean, we've tried mechanisms to have better working between the departments. I mean, Carol's here as well. She knows that we have tried in the past to get departments to work closer together. But I think it does come back to the programme for government. It does come back to the budget lines and an agreed sense of this is the direction of travel. The Bengoa reforms that were agreed by all of us, Mark McGuinness was Deputy First Minister, I was First Minister, Michelle O'Neill was Health Minister, we all of the rest of the Executive agreed those Bengoa reforms, and I know that some of them have been taken forward by the Health Minister insofar as he can. But there's a real need for a whole of government push for something as fundamental as our health service, which of course we know is under increasing pressure all the time. So there does need to be, I think, mechanisms to try and make, and not something, here I am suggesting a reform, that needs to happen, to have that better cross-government working to make things happen that will be of a huge impact, I think, for our citizens who will then see things happening.
What, do you want to come in there? Or?
Yeah. Well, taking up first of all the point about the idea of the programme for government, which was central to the concept of the Assembly and the Executive that we designed in the agreement, that programme for government, which was then to be discussed annually and similarly budget, not because we wanted just a one-year programme for government or a one-year budget, we see the value in the multi-annual, but everything has to be subject to scrutiny and performance and adjustment or whatever under the oversight of the Assembly. I think we could benefit from more active oversight in many ways by the Assembly itself. I think there's a case for more joined-up scrutiny than there is. So we think about the joining up maybe that is needed as between government departments and at the level of the Executive. There could be more joined-up scrutiny at the level of the Assembly itself, so that if there is meaningful programme for government with meaningful commitments and targets in it, one of the things the Assembly could do is, as well as its various statutory committees overseeing the different departments, it could set up dedicated committees that would actually back and track delivery of some of the key precepts of the programme for government itself, able PAC style to bring in people from different departments and agencies and say, what's happening here, what's delivering, or you're the hold up on this, you're the hold up on that, what's happening. And I think that would be an aid to ministers. I can remember in the early stages as a devolved minister, actually finding comfort in being able to say to civil servants, it's not a matter of you being able to put me in a corner and getting me to sign this. I have to be able to present this to an assembly and get it approved and agreed, or whatever. So you're able to actually use assembly scrutiny in a way as a strength to yourself as a minister when it comes to policy matters. Not least when it came, for instance, to the civil servants were saying, oh, you know, the strategic rail review has said the railway lines should be reduced to a core network, and I was able to say, well, not only, it's not just because I'm a Derry MLA that I wouldn't do that. The fact is, there's no way an assembly is going to accept that. So that can be used. So let's not underestimate that there could be more done by way of the assembly. For instance, in terms of capital expenditure and public procurement, where we have continuing underperformance regionally, and it's not confined to here. When you hear colleagues south of the border and all the rest of it, it's a chronic issue there as well. But I think bespoke assembly oversight on capital expenditure, which was something we thought would happen after reinvestment and reform, was the idea that what was planned as a strategic investment body, and it wasn't just some of us as ministers who had conceived this. The then Finance and Personnel Committee, under the chairmanship of Francie Malloy, and the deputy chair was James Leslie of the UUP, had actually said there needs to be a new central driver to manage and oversee capital expenditure across government departments, rather than relying on the underperformance by government departments, who in turn were relying on all sorts of consultants here and there to help them not deliver on their various programmes or run over budget. So I think that would actually help more of the joining up as well, if there was that sense of joined up scrutiny. I think that would force departments to collaborate a lot more. Going back to the point that Arlene and yourself has made as well about civil service reform and how departments work. I can remember whenever we had one of whichever Stormont House agreement it was that came up with the voluntary exit scheme from the civil service. I remember when I joined those discussions, I said, "But that's grand, you're talking about reducing the civil service. Where's the case for reform?" And I remember Peter Robinson, "But sure, we're reducing the number of departments." I said, "No, but actually reform in how the civil service works, but also how we treat the civil service and how we as politicians ask it to work." And so I think when it comes to serious, public policy challenges, maybe rather than always just setting up interdepartmental working groups where the different officials come from the different departments to basically take turns to block things from meeting to meeting. What's wrong with saying, well, we're trying to encourage a faculty of policy development within our civil service, and we'll ask one or two named civil servants to actually look at an issue and go round the different departments and then come up. And they may come up with mad proposals, they may come up with challenging proposals, but at least they come up with coherent proposals, rather than people coming from the different departments in the name of a ministerial, cross-ministerial working group, interdepartmental or whatever, and cancelling each other out and discussions getting nowhere. One of the other points that helped in the early days, the idea of more joined up work and thinking across departments, was in the first executive we had executive programme funds, and the idea of executive programme funds was that proposals would have an added priority if they were backed and supported by more than one department or minister, and if they related to work that crossed between departments, and there was definite value in that. Unfortunately, the executive programme funds never happened again. They happened in that first mandate. They should have been grown, they should have developed, and obviously the scope of those funds should have changed and been recast on how they operated under the executive, because we needed a different executive substructure if we were going to make them a long-term mechanism. But that is something that we need to do. This idea of just having government where the budget comes and the money's just put out to the government departments per se, and people are then trying to track it after that, doesn't always work. So consistent with a joined up programme for government, things like executive programme funds to support particular priorities that cross departments, and a united assembly oversight and insight, and I think an assembly budget oversight committee would help as well.
Thanks, Chair.
John?
Just one arising. I only need a one-sentence answer, Chair. I'm conscious of time. And just arising out of that to both of you, do you believe then to achieve collective responsibility and collective ownership of the programme for government, it might be advantageous to get pre-agreement to a programme for government before entering an executive, and maybe a pre-funded one? What we see often is after hiatus, a big flurry of activity, get back in and we'll talk about it afterwards, and then there is no buy-in to the process and it's every person and every minister for themselves. Is there merit in getting that pre-agreed, pre-funded programme for government prior to an executive formation?
Well, that presupposes two things. First of all, that you have the budget in place early on, and that's not always the case. But also, I think the worst thing that could happen after an election where people have expressed their views and want their mandate respected, that we then don't go into government for 3 months. I think that would send a bad message. I understand why the message is always put forward that we should have a PFG in place before we enter government, but I think it should be given a limited number of weeks. I think it should be the priority when we go back into government, but I think just not doing government until we get the PFG in place would send out a negative message. That would be my concern.
I don't think you could have I think it's hard, as Arlene said, to have, a fully fleshed out programme for government agreed before you could go ahead with the appointment of ministers, etc. Come back to the original agreement. Part of the thinking was that the whole Assembly electing the joint First Ministers would probably be on the basis that whichever tickets came forward for joint First Ministers would probably be advertising some core ideas that they would be working on for the executive programme for government. The idea then is, but that doesn't mean it's all pre-cooked and preconceived, because the different parties who would then nominate the ministries should then see their ministers contribute to the programme for government from the point of view of the insight and interests of that department.
Thank you, Chair. Appreciate that.
Thank you. No, in the interest of budget scrutiny, I need to be in the chamber very soon to do the budget bill, so I'm an incentive for me to be brief. So I'm going to try and ask brief questions. First of all, Baroness Foster and Mark, thank you both for coming. Genuinely, your time and experience is really appreciated. Just first of all, I want to ask a question with kind of relatively brief answers if possible, in the interest of my time and getting through it before I have to go. I think a lot of why there is a focus on reform in the larger sense, and we can get on to some of the different meanings of that, is that over the last decade there have not been functioning institutions for half of them. There are huge frustrations around delivery, there are huge frustrations around the slowness of government, there are frustrations around the functioning of different strands. All of those things are true, but I think those are crystallised by the sheer absence of government at all. Do you both agree, and I'll start with you first, Mark, and as I said, I would like brief answers because I've got to go. Would you agree that simply not having institutions at all is basically something we have to solve? We can't have a situation where we any longer have just complete vacuum, no assembly, no executive.
Yes, I absolutely agree. I think it's a democratic scandal if we're asking people to vote for institutions and then we spend then months or even years with those institutions then grounded. So that confounds the whole democratic ethic that's meant to be there around devolution and around the institutions. Now, there's different ways of getting around that, but that sense of everybody being grounded, and as I say, going back to the original thing of the agreement, elective inclusion was meant to be about making sure that no party could be specifically excluded, that nobody could be vetted or vetoed in spite of their mandate. But we've ended up with a situation where there's been collective frustration of everybody's mandate.
Yes, of course. If the institutions aren't working, then that sends a very negative message.
I'm glad. Thank you both for that. Do you think then that it was, and I won't go all through obviously specifics, I'm sure you don't want to spend a lot of time relitigating RHI in this building, etc. But was it, if we accept, I mean, I would certainly think that Sinn Féin were wrong to collapse, and it was the right thing to do in 2017 despite the frustrations. Would you accept, do you think it was wrong after 2022? I mean, you just mentioned that the public would be frustrated if there was a 3-month-long negotiation over PFG before a government was formed. What happened after 2022? I accept you were out of the Assembly and out of that party. Was it wrong after 2022 for there to be a 2-year hiatus before an executive was formed?
I think it's indicative of the enormity of what happened with the imposition of the protocol overriding the cross-community consensus point within the Assembly at that time. I wasn't in the party at that time, so I don't know the discussions that took place and led to the decision not to go into the Assembly and Executive, so I can't make a judgment on that. But what I will say is that any time that the Assembly and Executive is not operating, then it does have an impact on the trust, it does have an impact on people's view of the Assembly, and I think some of the issues that members have mentioned today about people's view of the Assembly and its effectiveness comes from the fact that we've had periods where we haven't been operating.
Indeed. In relation to the question of reform, and I think you probably correctly said, Baroness Foster, that there is now a perception. Now, whether that perception is legitimate and how that perception is created is a subject for debate. We won't get to the bottom of it today. That reform has become a thing that is about to be done to unionists.
Yes.
However, this isn't a gotcha, but I do want to kind of track back to some of the things, because we've talked about things that happened in the past. You were a candidate in 2011 for the DUP. You were a minister then. 2011, the DUP manifesto called for significant, substantial reform of the institutions. It said there should be a move away from parallel consent towards use of 2/3.
Evolution now, I think it was called.
Well, I'm glad you remember 2/3 thresholds for voting. That's something I and my party have talked about. You talked about, I think, even looking again at designation. Why was it right and good in 2011, but now it's an offensive thing for unionists?
And I think that explains what I'm talking about, because actually it's how things are sold, and it's how this place has developed over this past period of time. And after the last election, when the DUP were no longer the largest party, they were the largest, the unionism is still the largest designation from memory, but it still is very difficult for people to see, oh, we needed minority protections when the DUP was the largest party. When they're not the largest party, we don't need minority protections. So you see, there is that sort of thing going on at this present moment in time. I don't think the DUP, as she said looking in, is against reform. I don't think it's against reform, but we have to deal with the reality of the situation that we find ourselves in at this present moment in time. To do otherwise is to, you know, it's very, very reckless, I have to say.
Would it be fair, would it be fair to say then that you think that if that's a perception, then perhaps you're an unaligned unionist now, unionist politicians, maybe of all stripes, who perhaps would, I think, theoretically do want this institution to work well, even if they disagree on specific policy things, should be assuaging that misperception or that perception, rather than kind of feeding into and saying this is simply about pulling up the drawbridge for unionists?
Well, I can't answer that because I don't know whether it is just about pulling up the drawbridge for
I can tell you
unionists.
from my perspective, my party, it is about just making it work better.
I think it's very important, and I've said this all along in this evidence session, that all of the parties try to build resilience and stability in these institutions, and in doing so they can then have the conversations about what reforms, because look, we all want to move to a more normalised system in Northern Ireland. I was in the DUP when we talked about those things that you have referenced in your comments, and I very much believed in them. I still do, but we have to live in the reality of the situation as well.
And I think we've agreed then that it is the preferable thing that we move to reform how those things work, even if there's a tone or a perception. So I would say, but
I think we can change. I think if people work together, they can change that tone perception. But I hope that people will work together to build resilience in the Assembly and Executive in a positive way, as opposed to taking lumps out of each other every day of the week.
Indeed. Well, and I hope this inquiry will do some of that. Just on one question which has come up very repeatedly, you mentioned it, Mark, which is about differential job titles. And in 1988, it was inserted as. Could you just clarify that? I have to be in the chamber in a few minutes. So, but it was effectively so that the Ulster Unionist Party then, not a criticism or relitigating it, they wanted to have a difference between the two titles.
They clearly felt that it was more sellable to the unionist electorate if there was a differential in the title, maybe, you know, regarded as maybe a precursor maybe to the signal idea that's there around the Ministry of Justice or whatever, this idea of showing that there was some residual primacy or preference there, but it's not real in any sense. And indeed, the person who was the legal advisor to the first executive, Dennis McCartney, this was the days before there was an Attorney General here and all the rest of it, all his written submissions to Seamus Mallon and David Trimble, and then to myself and David Trimble, were always just addressed to First Ministers.
Okay.
He said your generic and common title is First Ministers, there's no differential.
Arlene, just to say on the question then of, given Mark's views that it was about residual primacy, I think there was clearly in the election that sense of kind of, if you like, communal kind of competition existed. You've talked about effectively moving away from that perception of communal perception. Do you then agree that we should equalise the titles?
Well, I have no difficulty. I always seen Michelle as holding the same status as I did in the executive office. She could either block or agree to things. I could block or agree to things. I mean, that's the way the executive office works. It is a joint office.
Do you think it should have, like, when you held it, did you think it should have been equalised? Should it have been equalised then?
Well, it wasn't really a discussion then. I mean, I think Michelle referred to herself as joint First Minister on a number of occasions, and I think
it should happen now. I think.
I was surprised to see the switch in terms of chamber seating. I don't know why, whenever Sinn Féin took the First Ministry, why they had to change where they were sitting. Originally, that designation was about left-right.
Yeah.
That's how they chose it in the original assembly. That nationalist parties were essentially sitting to the speaker's left was the way it was done. So why it was done just because of First Minister, that creates this aura.
Do you think there's an issue there? Because we've talked about it in terms of titles and we've talked about it in terms of reform. It sounds like reform was grand for. I think people watching it would think reform was good when it was changed, removing. When reform was good when it meant removing these protections, which were largely associated with nationalists. It's bad now because we are saying it's associated with unionists. Joint titles were bad, differential titles were bad when they were seen to be, the other side is now saying joint titles were. Differential titles were bad when it was about a unionist primacy. Now they're good because it's our person who's on top. Is there a thing that we need to do which is about just removing some of these shibboleths and just moving towards actual kind of good governance rather than sort of symbolic things? Just briefly, Mark, yourself first and then Arlene.
Well, I agree for the reasons you've said. I think the problem was compounded by the terms in St Andrews, where it introduced this sort of algorithm for the appointment of First and Deputy First Minister, or a tribe algorithm, which in turn turned the Assembly elections into first past the post for First Minister. The idea of the joint election, joint nominations and joint election to joint office was a positive, and I think it's even more positive if the titles are absolutely equal.
I mean, symbolism, and Mark himself indicated why it was First Minister in 1998, because it was of that particular point in time, and people were looking for agreement, people were looking for consensus, and that's where it ended up. And I think that's, if people want to revisit that, then they can revisit that.
So you'd
it should be
content with that, and I would hope that others, including in Sinn Féin, would also see that removing this differential, this thing that was inserted for unionist supremacy in 1998, is now in the interest of everybody.
I mean, I'm not in the Ulster Party either, but I don't think it's fair to say it was a primacy thing. I think it was something that of its time was needed. It was necessary to try and get people over the ground.
It was also the case, I know from UUP negotiators at the time, it was also, they would say, they mightn't say it now, but they did say it before to me, that they did carry the mental reservation that if it came to the case that the biggest party was a nationalist party, they would say they still didn't want to vote for, a First Minister who wasn't a unionist or whatever. One
final one then, if I may, Chair. Just Baroness Foster, we've talked a lot about Brexit in this chamber. I used to ask you about Brexit, and we sometimes had fun exchanges. But obviously we disagree. I promise relitigate Brexit. But I would just say on this question about the Good Friday Agreement and the institutions. Obviously, now we have the East West Council, and indeed Intertrade UK, which is a body of which you are chair. I'm not going to ask you loads of detailed questions about Intertrade UK, but it's fair to say that that is out with the protections of the agreement. It doesn't. So you mentioned earlier on the St Andrews reforms, which meant that the NSMC was and and in the sense by extension,
yes,
Intertrade Ireland by accountable to the Assembly Chamber. Intertrade UK and the East West Council are not accountable.
No, they're not. And you know what? I would have no difficulty, just to be very clear, if they were to be accountable to the Assembly, because I feel that we're doing good work for the people of Northern Ireland, and if it were to be accountable to the Assembly, I would have no difficulty at all.
You might have to come back here and give evidence more to committees. That would be
what a great thing.
Just if I can add one point on post-Brexit arrangements. I recall, because I was in Westminster and I was on the select committee that was dealing with exiting the EU, but it was the DUP's position at that time that devolved consent should not be required for any of the post-Brexit arrangements, and in particular Sammy Wilson, as a member of that committee, was warning against devolved consent, particularly in Northern Ireland, because that would trigger a move to cross-community consensus be needed, and therefore that would be, as he put it at the time, that would be a Ramoner's veto. That was the DUP's position on cross-community consent and Brexit and post-Brexit arrangements.
The UK-wide system of Brexit he was talking about, not the imposition of the protocol and what it meant.
It was about the details as it affected any of the
I'm going to try and keep this tram on the rails.
Well done, you've done well so far.
Michelle Guy.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you both for the evidence today. It's been really detailed and very appreciated. I just want to, I guess, set the context of my questions, which is very much the context of this inquiry within this committee. And we're having an inquiry on institutional reform. So I guess that's the kind of evidence that I want to get today to help inform that reform discussion and make sure that we can use it to formulate hopefully some decisions going forward. So I just want to ask one question that would be just very direct. It touches a wee bit on some of the stuff that others have asked. But do either of you believe, and maybe start with you, Mark, and then yourselves, Baroness Foster, do you believe any one party should have the power to bring down the Assembly and the Executive, even when other parties are ready to govern?
No, I don't. For the reasons that I've said, the elective inclusion was about making sure people couldn't vet or veto. One party mandate couldn't be vetted or vetoed. We've ended up in a situation where all parties' mandate was frustrated, so that's just simply wrong.
So the reality is that nobody can force a political party to come into office if they don't want to come into office. We've seen that in the 1980s when nationalism stayed out of the prior Assembly and administration. We've seen many examples since the Executive and Assembly was up and running since 2007, and before that, actually, since 1998. So I think you can bring in mechanisms to stop people from collapsing the Assembly. The question is, would the electorate, if there was a significant chunk of the political representation not sitting in the Executive and Assembly, what credibility would they give to that Assembly and Executive? So I think the idea of having everyone in the tent trying to find solutions, building resilience, building stability is the best way forward, obviously. But I know there's been discussion about mechanisms, and we looked at mechanisms during the last talks process before 2020 on a mechanism to stop somebody. But I mean, the reality is somebody can just walk out and stay away. If it's a unionist bloc, then nationalism and the Alliance Party would be here on their own. And it's the same if Sinn Féin decided to stay out, then it would just be unionists and the Alliance. So I don't think that would work. So I think what we need to focus on is trying to build that consensus.
So if people can walk out, do you think, though, that they shouldn't be allowed to stop everybody else governing? If I know, obviously, Mark, you've provided us with a lot of detail in your written submission, so Baroness Foster, if you don't mind, I just want to probe that a wee bit more with yourself, based on some other comments that you had made during the 2018 collapse, for example. Sinn Féin brought down the institutions in 2017, and you said that it was not acceptable and cannot be allowed to continue. You made the point about key public services such as schools, hospitals and roads being unfairly impacted, and you made the statement that 4 out of 5 parties would form an executive today. So for me, that last bit in particular speaks to the necessity to remove those single party vetoes. So are you still on the same page with that?
I am on the same page as that, absolutely. But when we looked at trying to formulate a mechanism to say, right, if we take the 2018 example, and there's been examples on the other side, so I'm not pulling this out, if Sinn Féin decided to stay out of the executive question, first of all, would the other party stay in? I'm not sure your party would have stayed in if it was just unionists. I'm not sure Mark's party would have stayed in if it was just unionists and Sinn Féin wasn't there. And vice versa. Will people join an executive when one of the main blocks is not there, is the question. Because, obviously you'd want to see government continuing. I wanted to see government continuing. I said at the time, let's get back into government and sort out the issues around the Irish language, which was the main thing at that particular point in time, alongside government. But that wasn't accepted by Sinn Féin at the time. So the question is trying to find a way that we include everybody in the tent and get everybody moving forward.
I think you're quite right that people want to see government. I think if you look at the evidence around this in terms of polling and data from the public, very much the impetus around this conversation is to ensure that we have government, and not having government has had a detrimental effect on Northern Ireland.
Government, I think, is what people want to see.
Absolutely, and being able to collapse the Assembly, I think, in itself and at its essence is ineffective. So I want to move on then. I think it's really appropriate, especially having yourself here, Baroness Foster, to ask about the COVID inquiry findings. It was an independent process. It was established by government precisely so lessons could be learned by political institutions. So that has to include us. So the essence of what I want to get to is, how do we stop institutional collapse or misuse of vetoes from ever undermining an emergency response again? So the public inquiry concluded definitively that, first of all, our lack of preparedness for that pandemic was exacerbated by collapse of the institutions from 2017 to 2020. And when the executive then did return, cross-community voting was abused to block public health measures. So I think we can take from that and from the inquiry itself that there are potentially people, or most likely people, who are not alive today in Northern Ireland because of the abuse of that those mechanisms. So would that in itself not be reason enough for us to take seriously reform of some of those mechanisms?
Well, I don't accept that is the case. I think everybody came to the COVID executive with the best of intentions. Yes, I think it has been found that none of the administrations, in fact, no country was prepared for the onslaught of COVID in the way that it came towards us. And we were all trying to deal with something that was very, very difficult at the time. I think some of the lessons that have been learned around the closure of schools, the closure of businesses, have to be taken on board as well. Should we have locked down at particular points in time? Should we have allowed children to go to school and not been, because those children are still dealing with the consequences of not being in school at that particular point in time. So there's a lot to discuss around COVID. I think it's also important that you look at the Belfast Agreement and the Northern Ireland Act around the petition of concern, because it talks about the taking of key decisions. And I can think of no bigger key decisions than some of the decisions that we took around the COVID inquiry or the COVID pandemic. It was, and I'm on record as saying this, the most difficult time in my political life to take those decisions. It was a horrendous time. We were taking decisions that meant that people were in their homes all of the time. They weren't out. They couldn't access cancer treatments. They couldn't access some of the things that they fundamentally needed. It was just horrendous, I have to say, and it had a huge impact, of course, on those who suffered as a result of COVID and lost family members. It also had a huge impact on everyone. If you look around the world and you look at the people who were administering government at that particular point in time, you will notice that a lot of them are no longer in positions of authority. It was a horrific time for everybody.
Can I just draw it down to, obviously, again, the context of
yes.
the conversation we're having today is about institutional
But you made the allegation
reform.
that we were taking decisions that caused people to lose their lives. We were taking decisions in good faith around a table at a particular point in time, and it's always good to retrofit in where we're sitting now in this very calm position in room 21 and having this discussion. We were being bombarded with different advice from different people all of the time as to what decisions to take, and it was a very, very difficult time.
I think at the end of the day, and again, in the context of institutional reform, being able to use a communal veto around health measures. Feels like that.
The point is, it's not a communal veto, it is a mechanism that can be used around key decisions, and it's important that when people discuss the petition of concern that they look at the purpose for it in 1998 and they look at the legislation at that time as well.
Okay. We talked about, sorry Mark, did you want to come in?
Yeah, well, it's just to make the point, you've looked at some of the lessons that might be there when we reflect on the COVID period.
Just like this was the inquiries.
Yeah. Well, it's just to make the point, and I know what Arlene has said about where that ranks in terms of the scale of difficulty and sensitivity in terms of her experience in government. The only thing like that we had in the first executive that touched on was foot and mouth, which obviously had its own emergency, but it was very much a sectoral thing. It did raise sensitivities of borderism, because there was issues about the land border that had to be dealt with there. There was also issues about sealing the ports, which had sensitivities for other political dimensions or whatever. But the fact is, we were able, in a joined-up way, to deal with those, despite the different perspectives and issues that were there on a constituency or other basis. In terms of now, that was multiplied hugely in terms of the complexity and the challenge of COVID. Obviously, the inquiry is looking at different things in different jurisdictions around decisions that were taken. And those decisions weren't just taken by government, they were taken in many ways collectively by the political class and indeed by the Assembly at large or whatever. So I think it's important that we don't just try to isolate this to which party was in which ministry at the time or whatever. We need to look more widely at that. But one of the things I did reflect on previously in giving evidence in another place when I was questioned about, is there much value in this idea of having joint First Ministers at all or whatever. During that whole COVID crisis, there was value in, I think, what Arlene and Michelle O'Neill were able to do and represent whenever there were collective executive decisions. The fact that they were able to represent those and speak to those in the way in which they did, in the very difficult and artificial circumstances we had then, I think was important and had a value. If you think about something like COVID, if we had government here that was being managed very much with the predominance of one party, there maybe wouldn't have been the same understanding or tolerance of a lot of the decisions and restrictions that were taken at that time. So there was actually a value in the point of the joint office and the degree of consensus that represented. Now, I accept fully your question about the use when it came to some specific decisions about the cross-community device to veto decisions. I think that's wrong. And again, I go back to the point that the petition of concern was meant to be there to identify an issue that would then be frisked and tested, and then the decision could be taken. It wasn't there to say, right, no decision can be taken in that direction.
We've talked a lot about consensus and the need for consensus. The petition of concern, as it's deployed, quite often is deployed as a veto, and it's not a mechanism of consensus, and it has been deployed recently here in the Assembly. I just want to get a sense then of the cross-community votes and how that kind of impacts on consensus as well, which is material to that. So weighted majority is just another way to get consensus that's cross-community as opposed to the parallel consent. So are there any kind of legitimate objections to moving in that direction if we are still getting cross-party and cross-community consent by weighted majority? Does that not seem like a reasonable step forward in terms of reform?
Well, I think for reasons that were maybe touched on by the chairman earlier, if you simply say, right, we're abandoning any of the previous provisions around cross-community support being allowed by either the qualified weighted majority of the 60s and the 40s or parallel consent, which was a term that was coined originally by Dennis Howe of ASDLP. It was his shorthand for the rule that was there in the talks. of parallel consent, and then what happened was Seamus Mallon became so besotted by the words, he insisted on that wording actually being in the agreement, and in many ways, some of the agreement was written almost to shoehorn that term parallel consent in. Under the agreement, parallel consent is actually only required specifically for one issue, and that was for the joint election of the First Ministers. The Speaker, for instance, or any of the other tests could be done by either the qualified weighted majority or by parallel consent. But of course that unique requirement for parallel consent was done away with, courtesy of the DUP of all parties at St Andrews. So then for the DUP to end up saying, oh no, parallel consent is key and central, whenever they removed the one bespoke requirement for it. But I think just moving to the weighted majority of the 2/3 alone could be a problem. But there's no reason why you can't, just as the election of Speaker and other things was allowed to be either by parallel consent or by qualified weighted majority, there's no reason why you shouldn't add a third threshold to the menu of, say, a 2/3 majority or whatever. And the fact is, all parties have accepted 2/3 majority without reference to designation or whatever as the basis on which assemblies can dissolve themselves, terminate their mandate to bring forward another election. So that 2/3 of all MLAs, I think it is already there, and all parties have accepted that from the 98 Act right through, and that has been repeated in some of the more recent legislation, like the elections, like the Ministers of the Elections and Petition of Concern Act, or whatever, where again the 2/3 majority is used around either the termination of the Assembly or asking the Secretary of State to rescind a decision to call an election or whatever. So those 2/3 are without reference to designation. So if parties have gone along with 2/3 majorities there without reference to the notion of designation, I don't see why parties should be averse to adding in a 2/3 majority, say, when it comes to restoring the joint election of First Ministers or the Speaker or whatever. But I think I would allow the Assembly the right to either do it by 2/3 majority or to do it by parallel consent or whatever. If you only have a 2/3 majority, say for the election of a Speaker to get the Assembly started, well, one or two MLAs could hold out very disproportionately. So if people think a large party can hold everybody else to ransom under the current system, under purely a 2/3 majority, a small party could hold everybody else to ransom if they wanted to. So I think relying only on the 2/3 majority could be a mistake, but adding it in as part of the additional democratic menu, I think would be very helpful.
And I think Mark has just demonstrated, Michelle, why there needs to be a discussion around these issues and consensus, because it is a very complicated situation. I mean, if you think, oh, we'll move to the 2/3 majority, but then what happens if the small parties object or whatever? So there needs to be, and it's the fundamental basis of my evidence today, reform can happen, of course, but there has to be consensus as to what that reform is, and the reason for the reform must be the effective good governance of this place and for the benefit of the people of Northern Ireland. That should be the underlying theme of all of this committee's work.
One final question, which is just linked then to the repeated theme I think everybody seems to agree on, have consensus hopefully, is wanting to make this place work and be effective. So how the executive itself works and that it is effective actually is fundamental to that. So I'm just going to pick out one of the 3-meeting rule. So the 3-meeting rule that stops papers from being blocked on the executive is being treated more like a convention and isn't operating perhaps as it was intended. Is it time to make that statutory? So at least the executive can be productive and people can move items forward.
Again, I think it's around having those fruitful discussions before the executive, before something actually makes it to the executive. So in the past, if there was a paper that wasn't making progress in the way that it should have been making progress, the special advisors and indeed the minister would have met with the people who had difficulties with the paper, and then you would have found a way to try and accommodate some of those concerns, put it into the paper and then move it on in that respect. So I certainly think that that's still the best way to deal with issues, as is the Party Leaders Forum, where you can flag big ticket issues that might cause a problem when they come to the executive table.
Yeah, I think there would be no harm in adding value to it by virtue of putting it on a statutory footing. I mean, I can remember I couldn't understand at times why, in my time in the executive, why items that were down for discussion suddenly weren't able to be discussed. You know, and you know, David Trimble would suddenly say, "No, we're not having that," or whatever. You know, he'd arrive in from London on a Thursday morning and say, "No, we're not having that," and then that's it, and you didn't always know the reason. Now, in those days, not many other departments were putting that much business in the way of the executive. Most of the business was coming either from the Office of First Minister and Deputy First Minister, or particularly from finance and personnel, because obviously that was by its character cross-cutting. All other ministers were tending to, you know, hide their homework quite a bit for understandable enough reasons. But what happened then was when people did surface, they didn't know quite what was happening, and ministers were frustrated and civil servants were frustrated at not knowing why something wasn't getting on the agenda of the executive, even though they maybe were discussing it through the Ministerial Reps Committee or whatever. So it was quite perverse in that sense. So something that means that departments and ministers know that business, that serious business that they're putting in the way of the executive is actually treated seriously and properly, and then people are able to make a mature decision around those issues is important, not just for the internal workings of government, but also for the outworkings, because there's usually key policy communities or key public services that are affected by these things.
Thank you. Michelle McElveen.
Thank you, and thank you very much both for coming today and for your presentations. I found it a really interesting session, and I think probably what's been most beneficial about it is the fact that you're both practitioners, that you've been through the system, you understand the system, and I think that's
scars.
whether or not I necessarily agree with everything that has been said is another thing, but I do very much appreciate.
We mightn't agree next week either.
I do appreciate that, and I suppose the fact that we're 2 hours in sort of reflects the engagement that there is even from members. My questions will be quite brief and more reflective maybe on some of the things that's already been said. We know that reform can happen, but we also know that reform takes time, and usually political reform is precipitated by a crisis, and I'm hoping that we don't get ourselves into that place again anytime soon. So today we have talked about the reform of the funding formula, we've talked about public service reform, civil service reform, and of course Assembly and Executive reform. What should be the priority today with regards to any aspects of those reforms in order for to make, I suppose, what we do and how we deliver it more effective and meaningful to those that we represent?
I mean, Michelle, from my point of view, the thing, as I've said to Michelle, around all of the reform programme should be how do we deliver better for the people who elect us into these positions. And for me, that's around having, and it may be out with the remit of this committee, but I think it should be something that the committee should consider. It's about the funding formula. It is about, and I take what Mark says around where my former party was in the past, but I think everyone is in the position now that they feel that the Barnett formula is not fit for purpose. There is a need to revisit it. There is a need to deliver better. Otherwise, you're going to then, if you bring less over from London, then the departments are in strife about what they can and cannot do. That causes strife within the executive about who gets what, who gets the priority, who doesn't. And I just feel that that should be the priority at present, aligned with civil service reform as well, so that civil service can support the ministers that are in position. So I'm afraid that's where I think the priority should be.
I think it should be a priority that institutional reform is delivered now in this mandate, maybe to guarantee to have effect with the next mandate, so that the public, whenever they vote in the election for the next Assembly, know that issues have been sorted around how a Speaker is elected and how First Ministers are appointed, so that there's no question of the prolonged stoppage. A number of years ago in Scotland, you know, post the referendum and all the rest, there was this whole issue in Scotland about how the need to guarantee to the Scottish public that the Scottish Parliament was permanent. You know, because there was this idea that the legislation from Westminster, in essence, was treating devolution as a concession. And of course, the experience in Northern Ireland of Stop Go added to this idea of devolution being a bit of an optional extra or whatever. So there was that need, that democratic imperative about a sense of a permanent government, a permanent parliament. Now, in the Scottish situation, it was they needed that signal from Westminster and from the UK government. I think here people want that signal from our own institutions. They want that signal from the parties that if you're asking us to give you a mandate to govern, it is a mandate to govern. It is to be a legislative assembly that does legislation and not one that basically downs tools or is frustrated by anybody else. So I think that's hugely important. There's no point in us having an assembly election whereby we all debate the fact of why there hasn't been reform and all the excuses for why there hasn't been reform, and people can cast a doubt over the worth of the mandate that they can give any given party or any given thing. So I think reform that cuts through all of these questions and all of the stuff that people will be asked, will you support this, will you support a nationalist Minister of Justice, will you support this, all these trap questions that are thrown up, have reform that removes all of those so that parties and candidates and MLAs can fight on the basis of what it is they're intending to do in terms of public services, in terms of public law, on the statute books, etc. That doesn't preclude addressing finance issues. It doesn't preclude civil service reform. I think civil service code of ethics, I know it's a bit of a wonky issue, but the Northern Ireland Civil Service Code of Ethics is something that I think should be looked at. I tried at the behest of civil servants raising it back in the very first mandate, and I understand fully why David Trimble and Seamus Miles says, no, you've enough reviews, there's too many things going on, we're not getting into that. But senior civil servants at the time did predict that there was going to be issues when it came to things like potential court cases where civil servants would find themselves backing one minister in a case taken against another minister supported by their civil servants, and that's a bit of a nonsense or whatever. So there is an issue for looking at the Civil Service Code of Ethics, not just in terms of the civil service having a responsibility not just to their own minister but to the wider public interest, but I think actually the Assembly should be built into the Civil Service Code of Ethics. And accountability to the Assembly and to Assembly committees. I think that could take care of a lot of the issues that have been raised around whistleblowing and signalling and all of the rest of it. So I think there is reform there. The one thing I will say on finance, it's not going to be a free run at the rickety wheel to go in on the Barnett formula, and the chances are, particularly this current government in Westminster, will meet any move to adjust on the Barnett formula to say that's okay, we'll adjust how it's calculated, we'll adjust the fiscal floor to change the amount of money that you get. However, you're only able to spend that money on equivalent services to Barnett. You can't spend that money on services that money isn't covering in England, and that'll include things like water and elsewhere or whatever, so just be careful. It'll be a financial version of English votes for English laws. The Johnson government introduced this thing of English votes for English laws as a way of trying to say to the Red Wall in England, oh, we're stopping these other people creaming benefits off you hard-working people in England while they get the benefit of having their own laws, while they make our laws and they get their services. They will do something like that will be raised. So when it comes to the whole question of revenue raising and all the rest of it, parties need to be ready for that to be part of that very difficult negotiation as well. I just think we need eyes open on that.
I also think, though, it's not a discussion that you go into alone. You go into it with the Welsh and the Scots as well, because they are very unhappy at present in terms of the Barnett formula.
Which brings us back to what we tried in the first mandate, and we had Wales lined up. Scotland didn't, because Gordon Brown, of course, was telling Scottish Labour, you're doing well under Barnett and I look after you. So Scotland weren't cooperating with us in the challenge. Wales were, and then they were bought off with Objective 1 and a few other things.
Thank you. And given your comment that you feel that reform should come from a request from the parties, I get the impression that means you think that it should be all the parties. Do you think it was a wise move by the Agriculture Minister a couple of weeks ago to basically go on a solo run and call for the British and Irish governments to lead a process of reform?
Well, under the agreement, the two governments have a role in terms of the broader review mechanisms for the agreement itself. The fact was, I suppose, the most significant review exercise was maybe at St Andrews. the Irish government directly leaned in on Strand 1, and they directly leaned in on Strand 1 at the behest of the DUP. Because the SDLP were being specifically leaned on to accept the change in the removal of the joint election of First and Deputy First Minister, the stuff about the Assembly and Executive Review Committee, and all, as a way of saying there's going to be permanent and ongoing change from the original agreement, and the value for money review, so-called, about the Strand 2 arrangements as well, or whatever. And then the drive-by veto of the added stuff of the reference of 3 ministers, calling things in, and all of the rest of it. So the Irish government were leaning in very heavily at St Andrews. So, parties have been happy for the 2 governments to be part of overall reviews. And when we consider, when the Assembly came back previously after Stall, the Irish government as well as the British government was involved in those negotiations. So I don't think it's completely stray or off the books for the Agriculture Minister or anybody else to ask the 2 governments. I don't think he was actually saying it's all down to the 2 governments to do things regardless of anybody else. But as I think of saying there needs to be a headline commitment to the case for review or reform, because, at times you do hear from each of the governments, and at times you hear it from them jointly, that there needs to be reform, but it's never now, and they're never putting it on the agenda for now. And, a couple of years ago it was the case, yes, both governments were saying there needs to be reform, but the concentration is on getting the institutions back up and running. There's no point in pursuing reform. Then it was when we had the institutions up and running, well, we need to make them work and we need to see them deliver. There's no point in being distracted by reform. Now we're being told, it's coming up to a new assembly, it's coming up to the election, it's not the time to pursue reform. When is going to be the time to pursue reform? And I think sufficient reform to allow people know that the next assembly election is taking place with a different prospect than previous assembly elections is hugely important.
Sometimes I think I'm living in a parallel universe, Michelle, because the idea that reform is going to be agreed before the next Assembly election, for me, is for the birds. Particularly the wide-ranging reform that Mark is proposing. I do think there needs to be a period of stability. I do think there needs to be a period when you are delivering effective governance for the people of Northern Ireland. On the point about the Irish government and the British government, I have said throughout this evidence session that reform must come from the parties here. If the UK government wants to facilitate Strand 1 reforms, that's fine, and you will know, having been in the room with me and Irish government ministers, that I have always pushed back very hard on their position in relation to Strand 1. Of course there's a position for them in relation to Strand 2, and if there's a reform coming in Strand 2 or in Strand 3, then the 2 governments should be involved. But in relation to Strand 1, the impetus for reform has to come from the parties here, because they have to own the reform and they have to make it work. And therefore, I think that this is the place to have the discussions, and I hope that Mark and I have helped put a few ideas for you this morning around where we think that reform should come from, and then it's for you to discuss where it should happen.
Okay, thank you very much, both of you. Thank you.
Thank you. Finally, Sinead.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair, and I appreciate your time, both of you. As Michelle said, it's been very useful. So I have 2 questions. There's been an obsession over the last while with the titles, what the First and Deputy First Minister are called. We've had numerous evidence sessions with academics over the last number of weeks, and we put this question to all of them, and all of them have said that it would merely be a cosmetic change, that structurally it would offer no value, as you have said, Mark, and you've said as well, Arling. They are equal in law. So do you agree that what this committee should be looking at, because if we can't elect a speaker and we can't elect a First and Deputy First Minister, what they're called is irrelevant. Should this committee be looking at how we elect those offices rather than fixating on what would offer structurally no advantage and would be a purely cosmetic change?
Well, it is a cosmetic change. I think that's right. Whether you want to have a discussion about that is obviously for the committee to have, and whether they think it would have any impact in relation to reform, whether it would send a signal, that's a matter for the committee. In terms of how a First and Deputy First Minister is elected, again, the consensus on that, there were reasons why it changed in 2006. I'm not going to rehearse all of those again, and the fact that the legislation didn't actually accurately reflect what was agreed in the St Andrews agreement. I wasn't actually at St Andrews because my 3-week-old baby was in the Royal Victoria Hospital at the time, so I had a very good reason not to be there. But I do think that there is space to look at all of those areas, but again, it's whether you can find consensus to deal with it all.
Mm-hmm. But I suppose it's your opinion on whether we remain fixated on what they're called, or is it, if we're serious about real structural reform, should we look at how they're elected, because that's the only way to get in?
I think I've said it's incidental, because I mean, you know, whether you're First Minister or a joint First Minister or whatever, people will call themselves whatever they want to call themselves. In law, the office is a joint office, so I always knew that, I always respected that, whether it was Martin McGuinness or Michelle O'Neill, so that's the reality.
Yeah. Well, I actually think Martin McGuinness was right whenever he said that if it came to a point where Sinn Féin would be the largest party and take First Minister, that the move would be to make the titles joint and equal. And I think that was actually right. I mean, we can look at reform and questions of reform, and yes, you know, you can change the physics of the rules and the institutions and all the rest of it, but sorting out the physics won't work if the chemistry isn't right as between how parties interact and everything. But just getting the chemistry right isn't enough either. You need at times the physics to work as well, because at times we've seen the chemistry work very well, but then if the physics hasn't been taken care of, you then have a problem later on when it comes to a different mandate or different personnel or whatever, or different prevailing moods. So I think there is value in just taking out the weeds of the false differential that is there. If something is there that is false and unnecessary, remove it. It's a weed, remove it. It is used at election time as though it is a pertinent point. There is this thing, this totemic significance added to whether one party is First Minister or can keep somebody else out from being First Minister. So for the exact same reason that I think we need to move away from this notion around the Ministry of Justice, that it's only available for certain people in certain ways and there's sensitivities if it goes elsewhere. I do think it needs to be equalised. You'd also mentioned in terms of the Speaker role. Remember when we were negotiating the agreement, parties wouldn't even agree to the title Speaker. The agreement is just presiding we've chair, and then later with presiding officer and others. People were very precious about even agreeing that office would be called Speaker, you know, because there was notions about what's going to happen and all of the rest of it. Also going back to the agreement when it comes to the question of the Speaker, the whole thing of the Speaker being put in by needing cross-community consensus and all that was in circumstances where people knew or felt that the first assembly there was going to be a lot of formative issues around the creation of rules and practices, so it was sensitive. I think we're at a stage now where people know that the Speaker's office, and particularly when you have deputy speakers and you have the clerks established, the business committee, there's less sensitivity around that role and more trust. So that's why I think it is much easier to move to allowing things like a 2/3 majority or whatever, and particularly if it's by secret ballot, if there's an option of secret ballot, because if secret ballot is good enough for the Dáil, if secret ballot is good enough for the House of Commons, a secret ballot option here for 2/3, that's one of the menu of options, would be useful as well. Does it make a whole heap of difference to the public out there? Not necessarily at first sight, but in terms of how the atmosphere in here works and how people's mandate is treated and counted, it makes a huge difference.
Okay, so just following on from Pat's question at the start, because I do believe we have gone beyond public perception that this place is delivering for people. We know that there's parties, particularly the DUP in this place, that aren't up for, have never been up for power sharing. And I note your response to Pat earlier, Arlene, but we have even in recent times seen the DUP, they wear it as a badge of honour, they'll shout across the chamber, we didn't sign up to the Good Friday Agreement. Or we have recently Paul Given's remarks that Sinn Féin aren't his partners in government. So, and then again, just we spoke about the Speaker in my last question, we've seen the partisan way that the Speaker has acted. So I think if people are saying that this place isn't, as you said, Arlene, delivering effective good governance. If we're not delivering on rights issues, if people see that there's issues around equality that still aren't resolved, we don't have a Bill of Rights. You said, Mark, that the British government, it's a case of the time isn't right. it's never now. It's always putting the long finger. So I suppose the question is, how long? I mean, if we don't do meaningful reform, how long will we be till we get to a point where the public will start to talk about and the pressure will start to come in terms of, in my opinion, the only real vehicle for reform is constitutional reform. So what I'm saying is it's probably more of a comment as opposed to a question, but I think I would be interested. I know Arning won't agree with what I'm saying, but I'd be interested in more in your perspective. If we continue to limp on and we continue to see these blockages in terms of the delivery of rights and the delivery of equality, if we don't have partners, willing partners in the DEP, I think the public will look for the ultimate vehicle of reform, which will be constitutional.
Well, I'd said earlier in response to Pat that I don't think that pursuing the need for institutional reform to improve the performance of the democratic institutions here necessarily has to be at the cost of also legitimately pursuing the case for a change in constitutional status. So that's my view. I'm for both. Be quite upfront about that. Just in case, just in case there would be any heighten of that, I would say I would make the point that those who want to continually resist any significant reform of the institutions here, increasingly leave people then to say, well, if institutional reform is not a goer, constitutional change is the only means whereby we can enhance our democratic self-actualization as a people. So denial of institutional reform, I think, actually aids the argument for constitutional change. I don't think the argument for constitutional change relies entirely on the dysfunctionalism that people associate with this place. I think it has entirely its own merits and legitimacy as reflected in the original agreement itself. But I think those who oppose institutional reform need to consider where that drives other people.
And Mark will forgive me if I say that sounds very much like a threat. And I hope it's not a threat, because I think what people need to find is a consensus on reform. And finding that consensus should not be with a sort of Damocles held over us that if it doesn't happen, then it's going to inevitably lead to a particular course of action. Because, of course, the best way to flourish is for the United Kingdom to flourish and for Northern Ireland within the United Kingdom to flourish. And that will always be my position. And I think we'll finish there, Chair.
Thank you.
I would just want to say it was not a threat. It was an observation. It was no threat.
So in finishing, can I thank you both for taking a 2-hour session with the committee? I wasn't expected to go on that long, but we very much appreciate it because neither of you are compelled to be here. You've both freely given of your time to try to help with this committee's deliberations. In both of your own ways, you have articulately demonstrated the difference of opinion that there is surrounding systemic reform of agreements and what they mean. And ultimately, I know accusations have been made about different political parties, but I would genuinely say that there is a concern that does future reform ultimately lead to greater stability, or does it destabilise things in the longer term? And that's a legitimate view for people to hold. I think you've drew very acutely to our minds the need for looking further at the issue of reform, both institutional, but also, and I think you both leant on this quite heavily, public service reform. That's certainly something that the committee can take up, but we really value you taking your time. And I've no doubt that you'll probably be hearing more from the committee in the future about its deliberation. So thank you all very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I think that was a threat.
No, no, not you, him.
All right, that was right.
That was the return serve.
Thanks for the warning.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, now. Okay, members. So we have run on as expected with that session. So I know the budget debate is happening. I want to try to wrap things up. So can I invite the clerk to brief the committee on the future meetings or other issues seeking review evidence gathering processes?
Chair, just I won't go into any detail on this because the committee's running over time. Just to say, sorry, there will be a Hansard of this session available in a normal way. Hansard staff are covering plenary, but it is recorded and there will be a Hansard, so just for the record. But the pages 15 to 16 of the pack set out how the inquiry evidence gathering process is going to pan out over the next few months, so just draw that to members' attention. And there's a letter to the Assembly Commission Chair for consideration in relation to the
Page 59 on that engagement piece, members, there's a draft letter. Have any members any comments to make in relation to that? Jill?
I suppose still for the record, I have concerns with regards to the money that's being suggested around this exercise.
Okay. Members content with actions as drafted at page 59, Annex E of the report? Yeah, okay. Members, are we content to schedule an oral briefing session with Owen Tennyson representing the Alliance Party and Anne Watt from Pivotal for the 12th of May 2026? Content? Thank you. Agenda item number 6 was review into the Assembly Executive for raised briefing. As members have mentioned, it is for noting. Members content? Agenda item number 7, which is correspondence. Could I refer members to the correspondence received from the Committee for Communities at page 85? Could I seek agreement to respond to the Committee for Communities to advise that the AERC has 4 ongoing reviews to complete before the end of the mandate, and as such its forward work programme is fully committed, and suggests that the Communities Committee raises the issue of the timeliness of departmental responses to statutory committees with the CLG, which oversees the protocol between the Assembly and the departments in that regard. Content?
Yeah.
Okay. Agenda item number 8, which is forward work programme. Refer members to the forward work programme at page 94. Are members content to note?
Chair, I thought we had penciled in the first and deputy first at some stage.
Sure, yeah,
I don't see them in this.
There have been 2 dates have been offered to First and Deputy First Minister. There hasn't been confirmation of their availability as yet.
So I presume it's the 21st and the 12th then? 21st of April and 12th of May.
So we'll chase that up and see where things are with that. Obviously, we need to slot that in for a session.
And we've Paul penciled in for the 2nd or the 23rd. Paul Gibbon?
That's right. Paul has confirmed he's available on the 23rd.
Okay.
Okay. Members content?
Yeah.
Forward work plan? Okay. Next agenda item, which is number 9, AOB. I have none. I haven't been notified of any. So next agenda item 10 is date, time and place of the next meeting. Could I inform members of the committee will meet again on the Tuesday the 24th of March at 9:30 in room 21. And I thought I adjourned the meeting. Thanks, members.
Thank you.
Thank you.